In 1917, police searched the building where 18-year-old Ruth Cruger had last been seen. They found nothing. 4 months later, a female investigator came back to that same building, and this time, they found what police had somehow missed: Ruth's body, buried beneath the basement floor. The woman behind that second search was Grace Humiston, an investigator newspapers would soon call Mrs. Sherlock Holmes. But the question hanging over this case was pretty simple. How could police search the very place Ruth had disappeared and miss her? I'm Ivy Monroe, and this is Her Strange Hour, where we tell the true stories most people never hear. The mysteries, the strange history, and forgotten women. This week's story is one of those. In February of 1917, 18-year-old Ruth Cruger left her family's home in New York City to run a few errands. Snow was falling, and one of her stops was a nearby motorcycle shop where she planned to have her ice skates sharpened. Ruth never came home. Police searched the shop and found nothing. As weeks passed and the investigation went nowhere, Ruth's father refused to give up. Eventually, he turned to a lawyer and investigator named Grace Humiston. Grace and her team spent weeks going back over Ruth's case, sometimes working 15-hour days, looking for the break police had missed. And eventually, they found it. Now, let's go back to New York City, February 1917. On February 13th, 1917, Ruth Cruger left her family's home on Claremont Avenue in New York. Ruth was 18 years old. She had recently graduated from Wadley High School, and that day she had a pair of ice skates with her. She needed to have them sharpened. Nothing about this was supposed to be unusual. Ruth was running errands close to home. She was expected back. But hours passed, and Ruth didn't return. By that evening, her family was worried enough to start looking for her. And one detail quickly became important. Ruth had mentioned a motorcycle repair shop nearby where she could have her skates sharpened. So the next day, her older sister Helen went looking for it. The shop was owned by a man named Alfredo Cocci, and Helen had a surprisingly difficult time catching him there. She went to the shop that morning. Closed. She came back later. Still closed. Eventually, around 2:30 that afternoon, she finally found the shop open. Helen went inside and asked Cocci whether a young woman matching Ruth's description had been there with a pair of skates. And Cocci said yes. According to him, Ruth had dropped off her skates that morning. Then she came back later, picked them up, paid him, and left. He even claimed to remember which direction she walked. So now Ruth's family had something solid. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't somebody saying they might have seen Ruth across a busy street. The owner of this shop was telling them that Ruth had definitely been there. Helen hurried home and told her father, Henry. Henry contacted police. Detectives went to the shop. They spoke with Cocci, and at least one of the detectives apparently wasn't very suspicious of him. Cocci did business with local police officers. He repaired motorcycles, and he was described as a respectable businessman. Police also searched the property, and one detective's written report about that search was unbelievably short. 4 words. I searched the cellar. That was it. Nothing was found. And at this point, police began looking in other directions. Maybe Ruth had left willingly. Maybe there was a boyfriend her family didn't know about. Someone reported seeing a girl who looked like Ruth getting into a taxi with a man. There were rumors about a young man she might have known. And slowly, the focus began shifting away from the motorcycle shop, which is hard to understand now. Because just 2 days after Ruth disappeared, Alfredo Cocci disappeared too. On February 15th, Cocci left New York. He left behind his wife, his children, and his business. Eventually, authorities learned that he had gone back to Italy. Now, if I'm Ruth's father, that moves this man straight to the top of my list. My daughter visits your shop. She disappears. And within days, you leave the country? Henry Cruger certainly wasn't ready to move on. But police didn't immediately treat Kochi's disappearance as proof that he had harmed Ruth. Investigators continued following other possibilities. And some of those possibilities focused much more on Ruth than they did on the last man known to have seen her. There was even the suggestion that Ruth simply wanted to disappear. And this was happening during a period when newspapers were filled with stories about young women disappearing in large cities. At the time, people often used the term white slavery to describe fears that young women were being kidnapped or tricked into prostitution. So Ruth's disappearance became wrapped up in all of that. Maybe she had been kidnapped. Maybe she had eloped. Maybe she had some secret life her parents knew nothing about. Everybody had a theory, but nobody had Ruth, and her family was getting more and more frustrated. Her father eventually offered a $1,000 reward for information. The case received national attention. Ruth's photograph appeared in newspapers. Tips came in. Stories came in. There were supposed sightings. But weeks turned into months. And the one thing Henry Cruger did not do was accept that his daughter had simply chosen to disappear. By the end of May, Kochi had been located in Bologna, Italy. He denied knowing what had happened to Ruth. Back in New York, her family was still searching. And eventually, Henry turned to someone outside the original police investigation. A lawyer and investigator named Grace Humiston. And Grace was not coming into this case completely unknown. She already had a reputation for taking cases other people had either mishandled or given up on. Now, I promised you I wasn't about to stop this story and give you Grace Humiston's entire life history. So here's what matters. Grace was a lawyer. She had represented people who didn't have much money or power. She had investigated forced labor camps in the South where immigrant workers were being held in brutal conditions. She had also worked on cases involving people she believed had been wrongly convicted. So when Henry Cruger came to her, Grace was already comfortable questioning an official version of events. And she agreed to work on Ruth's case without charging the family. Instead of beginning with all the rumors about Ruth running away, Grace went back over what was actually known. Ruth left home. She had her ice skates. She went to Kochi's shop. Kochi admitted seeing her. Police searched his property. Then Kochi left the country. Grace kept coming back to that shop, and she wasn't working alone. One of the people helping her was an experienced investigator named Julius Cron. Grace and her team began talking to people around the neighborhood. Not just once, they kept asking questions. And eventually, they started hearing something the original investigation apparently had not developed. People remembered seeing Kochi around the time Ruth disappeared. One man said he had seen Kochi come up from his basement around midnight on the night Ruth vanished. He appeared nervous and dirty. Another person reported seeing him in a similar condition the following night. Now Grace had something more than a feeling. If those witnesses were right, Kochi had been spending time in that basement, late at night, right after Ruth disappeared. The same basement police said they had already searched. So Grace wanted another search, and she wasn't interested in someone walking down the stairs, looking around for a few minutes and coming back up. She wanted that basement properly examined. Getting access became a fight of its own. Kochi's wife resisted Grace's attempts to search the property. Grace kept pushing, and by June 16th, she finally had what she needed: access to the basement. This time, she brought people who were prepared to actually take the place apart if necessary. One of them was Patrick Solom. Solom was a close friend of the Cruger family and a foreman at Grand Central Terminal. And once he got into that basement, he noticed something. The basement was crowded with the kind of things you would expect to find underneath a repair shop. Benches, tools, chests, equipment. Nothing immediately screamed that something terrible had happened there. But one of the large chests near the corner sat slightly out of line. Not by much, about an inch. That was enough. Solom and the men helping him moved it, and underneath, the floor didn't look right. The concrete had been broken. Parts of it appeared to have been cut. So they started digging. They removed broken pieces of concrete, then ashes, dirt, cinders. As they went farther down, they found other material buried beneath the floor, including a large piece of rubber. And they kept going. Eventually, roughly 3 feet below the floor, Solam's shovel struck something. He climbed down to see what it was, and that was when he realized they had found a body. It was Ruth. She was still wearing clothing that matched what she had on when she disappeared 4 months earlier. Her ice skates were there too. Grace stopped Henry Cruger from going down into the basement to see what they had found. Later, Ruth was identified in part by the graduation ring she had been wearing when she left home. The examination of her body showed that she had suffered a fatal blow to the head and another severe injury involving one of her skates. I'm not going to get much more graphic than that because I really don't think we need to. What matters is that Ruth had been murdered, and she had been hidden beneath the floor of Alfredo Cocci's basement. The basement police had already searched. Actually, during the investigation that followed, police maintained that Cocci's shop and basement had been searched more than once. And that is the part of this case I keep coming back to. Because yes, Ruth was concealed. She wasn't lying in the middle of the floor where somebody could simply walk downstairs and see her. Someone had gone through real effort to hide her. But Grace's team moved things. They looked at the floor. They noticed that something was wrong. And then they dug. 4 months earlier, somebody had written, "I searched the cellar." Those two searches were obviously not the same thing. With Ruth finally found, attention turned immediately back to Alfredo Cocci. And Cocci was still in Italy. Italian authorities would not simply send him back to New York, but he was arrested there. And eventually, he confessed to killing Ruth. His version of what happened was incredibly self-serving. Cocci claimed that Ruth had somehow attracted or encouraged his attention when she came into the shop. Basically, even while admitting what he had done, he tried to place some of the responsibility onto the 18-year-old girl he had killed. Ruth had gone into his shop to have a pair of skates sharpened. That was it. Whatever Cocci told himself afterward doesn't change that. According to the case against him, when Ruth rejected his advances, he attacked her. He killed her inside the shop and concealed her body beneath the basement floor. And then, within days, he left the United States. Because Italy refused to extradite him, Cocci was prosecuted there instead. The legal process took years. His first trial began in 1919. The case was delayed, and he was tried again in 1920. On October 29, 1920, Alfredo Cocci was found guilty. He received a sentence of 27 years. But finding Ruth didn't just expose Cocci. It opened up a much bigger problem for the New York Police Department. Because now, everybody was asking the same question. How had they missed her? Grace Humiston publicly criticized the way Ruth's case had been handled. And once Ruth was found beneath a floor police claimed to have searched, it became pretty difficult to dismiss those complaints. An investigation followed, and what came out made the relationship between Cocci and some local police officers look very different from the simple idea that he was just a friendly neighborhood repairman. Investigators uncovered evidence of a kickback operation. The basic scheme worked like this. A motorist would get into trouble with police. That person could then be directed to Cocci, who supposedly had the ability to make the problem go away. Money would change hands. Cocci would keep some of it, and an officer involved in the arrangement would receive a cut. Now, I want to be careful here. That does not prove that police officers knew Cocci had killed Ruth, and it does not prove that someone deliberately ignored her body in that basement. Those are much bigger claims. But it did prove that Cocci's relationship with local police was closer and more questionable than it first appeared. And it gave people even more reason to wonder whether officers had looked at him as critically as they should have. Police officers involved in the original investigation faced scrutiny over how Ruth's disappearance had been handled, and Grace Humiston suddenly became nationally famous. Newspapers started calling her Mrs. Sherlock Holmes, but Grace herself pushed back on the idea that she had solved the case because of some mysterious female intuition. Her point was basically this: there was nothing magical about what she and Crone had done. They used common sense, and they refused to stop. In July of 1917, just weeks after Ruth was found, Grace was given a special investigative role with the New York Police Department, working on cases involving missing women and girls. Families from all over began contacting her. For a little while, Mrs. Sherlock Holmes was one of the most recognizable female investigators in America. And somehow, most people today have never heard of her. There are a couple of things about Ruth's case that really bother me. And surprisingly, one of them is not simply the fact that police failed to find her during that first search. Because I do think we have to be fair about something. Ruth was buried beneath a concrete basement floor. She was deliberately hidden. So I don't think it's reasonable to say a detective should have walked downstairs, taken one look around, and magically known exactly where to dig. That's not really what went wrong here. For me, the bigger problem is everything surrounding that search. Ruth's family gave police a very specific last known location. They found the man who admitted she had been inside his business. Then that man left the country just days after she disappeared. And somehow, the conversation still drifted toward whether Ruth had run away, whether she had a secret boyfriend, whether she wanted to disappear, whether there was something about her behavior that explained why she was gone. Meanwhile, Ruth's father kept saying, "My daughter did not just leave." And he was right. Grace Humiston didn't have supernatural detective powers. She didn't walk into that basement and instantly point to the exact spot where Ruth was buried. She went back over the case. She talked to people. Her team found witnesses who described Kochi acting strangely around the basement after Ruth disappeared. And then she did something incredibly important. She questioned whether a search that had already been done had actually been done well. And that is probably why I like the Mrs. Sherlock Holmes nickname and dislike it at the same time. Because it's catchy. Obviously, we're talking about it more than 100 years later, but it almost makes what Grace did sound more mysterious than it was. She paid attention. She took Ruth's family seriously. And when something didn't make sense, she kept asking questions. Sometimes that is what good investigative work looks like. And I also don't want Grace's story to swallow Ruth's. Because Ruth Cruger was 18 years old. She left home on an ordinary day with a pair of ice skates. She should have come home. Instead, for 4 months, her family had to listen while strangers debated whether she had secretly chosen another life. They never stopped looking for her. And Grace Humiston made sure that, eventually, someone looked in the right place. She couldn't bring Ruth home alive, but she gave her family the truth. And Ruth's case forced an entire city to ask some very uncomfortable questions about what happens when investigators decide who a missing girl is before they actually find out what happened to her. And that is the story of Ruth Cruger and the woman newspapers called Mrs. Sherlock Holmes. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you follow Her Strange Hour so you don't miss the next story. I'm Ivy Monroe. See you next time.